Do you still remember me? MOM. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to the 13-year-old boy standing in the dock. Ethan Walker, the defendant in an armed robbery. A homeless child, abandoned by the world. Judge Vivian Carter frowned. This boy had no family, no one on his side. A child criminal who needed to be punished. But then, that sentence rang out. Do you still remember me? MOM. The entire courtroom froze. Vivian's breath caught. No, it couldn't be. The memory she had buried for over a decade suddenly resurfaced. Ethan Walker, or rather, Nathan Carter, the son she had abandoned when he was 3 years old. The real story was just beginning. A dark secret buried for 13 years. A boy is drawn in a crime, but is he really the bad guy? A powerful judge stands between justice and motherhood. Will she have the courage to face her past? Can Ethan forgive? And will the dangerous man behind it all leave them alone? A battle that takes place not only in the courtroom, but also in each person's heart. Don't miss this story, a story that will keep you in suspense every second and touch you to the core. Subscribe to Golden Story now to watch emotional and surprising stories like this. Golden Story, where every story touches your heart. The courtroom was packed. The harsh fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over the prosecution, the defense attorney, and the small boy standing at the defendant's stand. The air was so tense that even the sound of the clerk flipping pages echoed sharply. Standing before them all was Ethan Walker, a 13-year-old boy accused of an armed robbery that the prosecutor had described as shockingly violent for a child. Judge Vivian Carter scanned the case file. On paper, Ethan was a homeless teen with no known family, no one to speak on his behalf. She had seen countless cases like this before, kids abandoned by society, turning to crime, standing before her like cornered animals. But she couldn't afford to be soft. The law had no room for emotion. She was known for her strict rulings, because if these kids weren't punished early, they could grow into even more dangerous criminals. The defense attorney stood up, launching into his argument. He claimed that Ethan had been coerced into the robbery, that he had no real intent to harm anyone. But the prosecutor immediately countered, presenting the security footage, grainy yet unmistakable. A young boy, baby-faced but with fierce eyes, held a black-painted toy gun that looked terrifyingly real. He shouted at the store clerk, demanding that the display cases be opened. When a security guard tried to intervene, the boy struck him hard across the head with the gun's handle. A deliberate blow. No hesitation. Vivian sighed. The footage didn't lie. Ethan Walker had committed a crime, and it was her duty to deliver justice. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Judge Carter looked up, her gaze locking onto the boy standing before her. Ethan Walker. Her voice rang out, steady and devoid of warmth. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? The courtroom held its breath. A few people shifted, expecting a weak plea for mercy, perhaps a tearful apology. But Ethan didn't speak right away. He stood still, his small shoulders trembling slightly. He didn't look down like most kids in his position. He didn't glance at his lawyer for guidance. Instead, he lifted his head and stared straight at Judge Carter. His expression, neither pleading nor fearful, held something else. Something deeper. Something eerily familiar. The room remained frozen. Then Ethan spoke, and when he did, his words sent a shock wave through the courtroom. Do you remember me? Mom. A silent explosion rippled through the air. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. The defense attorney went rigid. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. But no one was more shaken than Judge Vivian Carter. For a fleeting moment, her hand trembled on the gavel. No, impossible. Her heart pounded. She blinked rapidly, as if hoping this was some cruel joke, a mistake. But the boy's eyes, those eyes, were undeniable. A reflection of a past she had buried for over a decade. No one in the room understood what had just happened, but everyone could feel it. This trial had turned into something else entirely. This was no longer just a case. This was fate. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. No one spoke. No one even breathed. All eyes were locked onto Judge Carter, the formidable woman known for her unyielding discipline. And yet, now, She sat motionless, her lips pressed tightly together as if trying to suppress an internal earthquake. "Do you remember me, Mom?" The words lingered in the air, refusing to fade. It took a long moment before Judge Carter regained her composure. Inhaling deeply, she straightened her back, her expression returning to its usual steely control. But those watching closely could see her hands were still trembling. "This nonsense ends now." Her voice was cold, but there was a slight waver beneath it. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but you won't escape consequences by fabricating a story." Ethan didn't flinch. Another child might have cowered, might have broken under the weight of her piercing gaze. But not him. He only gave a bitter, knowing smile. "You really don't remember?" His voice was quiet, yet it carried through the silent room. "Nathan Carter. That's my real name." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor frowned. The defense attorney turned to Ethan, now looking at him with newfound curiosity and doubt. And Judge Vivian Carter, for just a brief second, looked as though she had been hit by a truck. But then she recovered. No, her voice was firm. "You're mistaken. I have no children." She slammed the gavel down hard, trying to reassert control. "This court will not entertain baseless claims." But there was one thing Judge Carter couldn't control: the media. Journalists in the gallery had captured every second of the exchange. Some had already live-streamed it, and within minutes, the name Nathan Carter flooded the internet. The trial was abruptly adjourned due to the chaos. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like vultures, scrambling for answers. Who is Nathan Carter? Is Ethan Walker really Judge Carter's son? What secrets are being hidden? But what no one realized, what even Judge Carter refused to admit, was that Ethan wasn't lying. Nathan Carter had been born on a rainy night in Los Angeles, the son of an ambitious woman and a father he never knew. For the first 3 years of his life, he lived in a small apartment, not wealthy, but safe. Then, one day, everything changed. One morning, he was taken to a shelter. He was told his mother would come back for him. He waited. 1 day, 2 days, a week, a month, a year, but she never did. The name Nathan Carter faded into obscurity. No one remembered the abandoned boy. Shelter workers gave him a new name, Ethan Walker. From then on, life was a cycle of foster homes and temporary placements. No family, no trust. He learned to survive on his own. And eventually, he slipped into the shadows of the streets. A gang found him when he was 10. They gave him food, shelter, something that resembled a family. But at a cost. They pulled him into crime, from petty theft to high-stakes robberies. That was how he ended up in this courtroom, face to face with the woman who had left him behind. Ethan had no reason to lie, no reason to make up this story, because it was real. The only question left was, would his mother admit the truth? Secrets from the past. The door to the study slammed shut, isolating Vivian from the chaos outside. Leaning against the door, she closed her eyes tightly, trying to control her breathing, but nothing could stop the storm of memories swirling in her mind. With trembling hands, she walked to the dark wooden desk in the corner of the room. The drawer on the right, which she hadn't touched in years, suddenly felt heavier than ever. It was just a simple movement to pull it out, but it felt like she was about to open the door to a past she had tried to bury for 2 decades. Her fingers lightly brushed past old papers, meaningless mementos, until they touched something familiar. A photo. She pulled it out, and the moment she saw the face in the photo, her legs went weak. A boy with golden hair, deep blue eyes, those eyes. Vivian took a deep breath, suppressing her trembling. It was Ethan's eyes. The image before her eyes faded, giving way to memories she had tried to forget for the past 20 years. 20 years ago, Vivian Carter was not yet a powerful judge. She was just an ambitious young woman, yearning for a bright future in the law. But then, she made the biggest mistake of her life, a wrong love for a man who was not worthy of her. Daniel, a man with a charming smile, but behind that was a life rotten by drugs and alcohol. Vivian, then only 19, believed that love could change a person. She loved him with all she had, despite the warnings of her family and friends. But that love could not save him. It only dragged her down with him. Then she discovered she was pregnant. The news hit her like a heavy blow. A young woman with a promising future, now tied to a small creature that had not yet been born. Her family didn't hesitate for a second. They gave her an ultimatum: give up the baby or give up her career. She fought. She thought she could be a mother and pursue her dream. But Daniel sank deeper and deeper into darkness. He didn't care about the baby in her womb, didn't care about anything but his addiction. Vivian realized she couldn't tie her life to him. And so, one rainy night, she did the unforgivable thing in her life. She left her son at a shelter. She looked at that tiny baby one last time, held his tiny hand, and whispered, "I'll be back, I promise. Just wait for me a little longer." But she didn't. She buried her past, poured all her heart into her career, became a judge, became a person no longer burdened by her past mistakes. For 20 years, she had lied to herself that the child had disappeared from her life forever. But now, the child was no longer a distant memory, no longer a vague nightmare. Instead, he was a 13-year-old boy standing before her in court, looking her straight in the eyes and asking, "Do you still remember me, Mom?" Vivian clutched the photo, her eyes stinging. She had tried to forget, but the past never disappeared. It was just waiting to come back one day and face her in the most cruel way. And now, there was only one question haunting her. What could she do to make things right? The truth behind Ethan's case. Vivian Carter sat alone in her office, the old photo still on her desk. The memory of her abandoned son haunted her all night. But now was not the time to wallow in regret. She had to find out the truth. A sense of unease had gnawed at her since the trial was adjourned. Ethan did not look like a criminal. He had a tough exterior, but his eyes held a deep pain, a pain she could not ignore. Most importantly, she knew her son was not a bad guy. She turned on her computer and logged into the police database. Ethan Walker's profile. He grew up in the orphanage system with no family, no one to take him in. He had been involved with street gangs since he was 10. For the past 2 years, he had been homeless. The jewelry store robbery was his first serious crime. But something was wrong. First-time criminals were often driven by greed, anger, or a sense of power. But Ethan was different. He had no criminal record, no signs of violence. Vivian frowned, digging deeper. Ethan's name appeared in another report, an investigation into a street gang led by Lucas Grant. Her heart sank. Lucas Grant. She opened his file. A photo appeared, a man with piercing eyes, a sly smile. His hair was streaked with gray, but she would never forget his face. Lucas Grant was Ethan's biological father. Her hand tightened on the mouse, her heart pounding. Vivian picked up the phone and called an old friend in the police department. "Jason, I need you to help me find everything I can about the jewelry store robbery last week. I want to know who was really behind it." An hour later, Jason sent her a file of the witness interview. She turned it on. A man's voice rang out, hoarse and strained. Ethan Walker wasn't the real culprit. He was forced. She held her breath. He didn't want to participate, but Lucas didn't give him a choice. He said if he didn't, he'd kill him on the spot. There was a pause. And the worst part is, Ethan doesn't know Lucas is his real father. Vivian felt her world spinning. Lucas Grant hadn't just found Ethan before her. He'd used her own son. For years, she'd blamed herself for abandoning him. But she never imagined that the person she was running from would be the one who pushed Ethan into the abyss. Lucas didn't come to save Ethan. He only saw him as a pawn. For the first time in 20 years, she knew what she had to do. She would fight to protect her son. Ethan confronts his mother. The Los Angeles Juvenile Detention Center was an old building, its cold gray walls filled with a heavy atmosphere. Dim fluorescent lights cast a shadow over the iron fences, where heavy footsteps echoed incessantly. This was where society's outcasts, children like Ethan Walker, were held. Vivian Carter stepped through the heavy metal doors, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the first time she had seen her son outside of Courtroom. There was no judge, no jury, no reporters, just her and Ethan. The guard led her into a small room, where a cold metal table sat in the middle. Across from her, Ethan sat with his arms crossed, his piercing blue eyes expressionless. His loose orange detention uniform made him look even more distant. His hands were resting lightly on his lap, so calm it was suffocating. Vivian paused, looking at her son closely. 10 years had passed, but he still had those eyes, the eyes of an abandoned child. She pulled up a chair and sat down, but before she could speak, Ethan spoke coldly. "You only remembered me when I became a criminal?" The words were like a sharp knife stabbing straight into Vivian's heart. Ethan tilted his head, his sharp eyes boring into hers. "I waited for you all my life," he said, his voice even but filled with bitterness. "But you never showed up. Not once." He smiled faintly, a smile as emotionless as if it had never contained warmth. "It's interesting that you decided to come back right when I was arrested." Vivian clenched her hands in her lap, trying to stay calm. "Ethan, it's not like you think. It's not like I think." He laughed, but there was only pain in his laugh. "So tell me, what's the truth? Wasn't I abandoned? Didn't you disappear from my life without a single glance back?" Vivian opened her mouth, but couldn't say anything. Because the truth was, he was right. Ethan looked at her, his eyes cold. "Do you think I deserve to be abandoned a second time? What are you here for? To apologize? To show remorse?" Vivian could see the anger in him, but it wasn't just anger. It was the pain of a child who once believed in a promise, only to be betrayed by his own mother. Her throat tightened. "Ethan, Mom, don't call me that," he interrupted, his eyes blazing with anger. "Mom? A mother doesn't abandon her child. Mom isn't just a title you can use when you see fit." Vivian wanted to cry, but she had no right to. It wasn't her who was hurting, it was Ethan. She took a deep breath, trying to find her voice. "Ethan, I didn't come here to make excuses. I know I was wrong. I abandoned you, and nothing can change that. But I want you to know that I will never leave again." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes no longer angry, but empty. "Too late." Vivian's heart clenched. "No, it's never too late, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking. "I know you weren't to blame for the robbery. You were forced. I know who was behind it." Ethan chuckled. "Oh, now you care about me." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes full of mockery. "What are you going to do? Play the hero and save me? Sorry, but I don't need you." Vivian looked at her son, a child who had lost all faith in the world, and realized one thing. Saying sorry wasn't enough. She had to act. "Ethan," she said, her voice firm, "I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness. I came here to get you out of here, and to make Lucas Grant pay." Ethan froze. A flicker of doubt flashed in his eyes. Vivian leaned forward, her voice low. "You don't deserve to be abandoned, and I won't let anyone take advantage of you again." Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at her, as if trying to determine if this woman was serious. And for the first time in 10 years, Vivian Carter was determined to prove that she wouldn't abandon her son again. The dangerous pursuit. In a dark corner of Los Angeles, Lucas Grant sat brooding in a rundown apartment, his cold gaze fixed on his phone screen. A text message from his underlings popped up. "Judge Carter is meeting with the kid. They're digging too deep." Lucas gritted his teeth, his knuckles clenching. He'd spent years keeping his gang out of the reach of the police. If Ethan, his son, opened his mouth, everything would fall apart. He couldn't let that happen. Lucas picked up the phone, his voice low and menacing. "I don't care who he is. Get rid of him before he says a word." Los Angeles Juvenile Detention Center, 2:47 a.m. In his cold cell, Ethan Walker sat on his metal bed, his mind reeling from what had just happened. She said she would protect him. She said she would get him out of here. But could he trust her? The one who abandoned him all those years suddenly came back and wanted to be his mother? A strange noise echoed in the hallway. Heavy boots. Not the guards. Something was wrong. The cell door swung open. 2 men entered, dressed in black, their faces partially covered by hoods. The dim light reflected off the guns in their hands. "Sorry, kid. No trial for you." Ethan's heart sank. Lucas had done it. He jumped up, backed away, but there was no escape. The 2 men were closing in, guns pointed at him. Bang! The gunshot rang out, but it wasn't from them. The door behind them swung open, and Vivian Carter appeared, her gun still smoking. "Stay away from my son." Her voice was cold as ice. "The legal battle. 4 days after the deadly chase, Vivian Carter sat in her office, her eyes glued to her computer screen. The news headlines were filled with sensational headlines. Judge Carter hiding relationship with teenager. Shocking scandal. Teenager's biological mother leads the trial. Vivian Carter, honest judge or hypocrite. She closed her eyes, clenching her fists. She knew this day would come, but she didn't expect it to explode so quickly. The media didn't care about the truth. All they needed was a sensational story, a judge hiding a criminal past, a scandal that could destroy the reputation of the entire justice system. But Vivian had no time to worry about public opinion. The only thing that mattered was protecting Ethan. Entering the battle. That morning, she sought out David Hall, a veteran criminal lawyer who had successfully defended dozens of complex cases. David looked at her over his glasses, his voice low but sharp. "You're asking me to defend a teenager accused of armed robbery and assault, and to fight a prosecutor who's hell-bent on bringing you down?" He raised an eyebrow. "Do you know this is a case that's almost impossible to win?" Vivian nodded. "I know, but I also know Ethan is innocent. He doesn't deserve to be ruined for a crime he was forced to commit." David sighed, flipping through the file she handed him. After a moment, he chuckled. "Interesting. We can turn this into a counterattack." But the prosecutor was not going to let it go. The prosecutor's counterattack. A few hours later, William Reynolds, the lead prosecutor in the case, held a surprise press conference. Standing in front of a series of microphones, his eyes were as cold as knives. Judge Vivian Carter has deliberately concealed her personal relationship with defendant Ethan Walker. This is not only a serious conflict of interest, but also raises the question of whether she abused her power to interfere in the case. Reporters snapped photos, recording every word. Someone in the crowd asked loudly, "Does this mean she will be removed from the judiciary?" Reynolds smiled faintly. "We are investigating, but I can assure the public that we will not let a scandal like this affect justice." Vivian watched the scene on the TV screen in her office. She knew she was being pushed into a corner. If the prosecutor could prove that she had violated her professional ethics, she would not only lose her position as a judge, she could also be prosecuted. The confrontation in the interrogation room. That night, she went to see Ethan. There was no longer any coldness from the boy, only worry. Ethan looked at his mother, then asked, "What's going on out there?" Vivian sighed. "The prosecutor wants to kick you out of the profession. They'll do anything to prove that you abused your power to protect me." Ethan was silent for a long time. "So you'll lose everything because of me?" His voice trailed off. Vivian nodded, without hesitation. "If that's the price to save me, then it's worth it." For the first time, Ethan was no longer skeptical. He saw the truth in her eyes. "Mom," he tried to say something but stopped, as if he wasn't used to the word. But in his eyes, something had changed. For the first time, he truly believed that she would not abandon him again. The painful betrayal. Ethan had never trusted anyone. After all those years of abandonment, wandering from orphanage to orphanage, he had learned one thing: trust can kill. But Michael was the exception. Michael was the only one who stood by Ethan. They had grown up together in the orphanage, sharing stolen meals from the kitchen, sleeping under the leaky roofs of foster families who had taken them in and then abandoned them. Michael had always said that they were each other's only family. So when Michael showed up outside the prison, saying he had a way to help Ethan escape, Ethan believed him without hesitation. And that was his biggest mistake. The trap. That night, Ethan sneaked out of his cell, following Michael's instructions. He ran down the dark hallway, where only a dim green light flickered. When he reached the back door, Michael was standing there, smiling. "Hurry, we have to go." Without a moment's hesitation, Ethan jumped into the car. But as soon as the door slammed shut, a cold gun was pressed against his temple. A deep voice spoke from the back seat. "You really think you can get away, kid?" Ethan froze. He didn't need to turn around to know who the voice belonged to. Lucas Grant. A hoarse laugh rang out as Lucas leaned forward, letting the streetlights illuminate his face. "You disappoint me, Ethan. I thought you were smarter than that." Ethan turned his head to look at Michael, searching for a sign that this was a mistake, that he hadn't betrayed him. But when Michael lowered his head, avoiding his gaze, Ethan knew it was over. "So you work for him?" Ethan's voice was hollow. Michael bit his lip, saying nothing. Lucas patted him on the shoulder, smiling amusedly. This kid is smart. He knows how to protect himself. Unlike you. Ethan felt a knife stab him in the chest. Michael was the last person he trusted, and he had betrayed him. Vivian arrived in time. The car sped off into the night, heading for an abandoned warehouse, the one Lucas had set up to clean up Ethan forever. What he didn't know was that Vivian Carter had been watching. She had suspected as soon as Ethan disappeared from the prison, and as she pieced together the clues, she realized this wasn't an escape. It was a trap. She hadn't arrived in time to stop Ethan from leaving, but she would arrive in time to save her son. Lucas's confession. The Los Angeles Federal Penitentiary is a grim place, a place where outcasts count the days until their sentences are over or never over. Lucas Grant is here, facing a litany of uncontested charges. But even locked within 4 cold steel walls, he shows no fear. He knows he's lost, but there's one thing that keeps him from being arrogant. Ethan Walker still doesn't really belong to Vivian Carter. And today, he has one last chance to plant doubt in that boy's heart. The final confrontation. Vivian and Ethan enter the interrogation room where Lucas is waiting. An old metal table separates them from him. Lucas smirks as he sees the two enter, his smile full of mockery. Well, that's touching. You two finally came to say goodbye to me. Vivian pulls out a chair, her eyes sharp. There's no goodbye, Lucas. There's only justice. Lucas laughed. Justice? Oh, right. You always believed in that. He tilted his head, his eyes on Ethan. But what about your son? Does he believe in justice? Ethan clenched his fists, trying not to let Lucas's word affect him. Lucas noticed and chuckled. Do you really think you can trust her, Ethan? He said slowly, his voice like a knife cutting into his mind. She abandoned you. She doesn't want you. I may have abandoned you, but so did she. How is she any different from me? Vivian gritted her teeth, but Ethan remained silent. Lucas continued, his voice smooth and venomous. Do you think that once this is over, she'll still be there for you? Don't be so naive. She abandoned you once, and she can do it again. Ethan stared at Lucas, trying to figure out his true intentions. Lucas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Do you want to know the truth? If I hadn't found you first, you would still be a useless, aimless boy. I gave you a chance to be strong. I made you a warrior. And her. He glanced at Vivian. She only came when you were a criminal. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Ethan clenched his fists. Lucas wasn't wrong. Vivian had abandoned him. She'd left him to grow up without anyone to protect him. And Lucas was the one who'd seen him first. In a most twisted and cruel way, he'd given him a purpose, even if it was wrong. So, did he really deserve to die? Or was Ethan the fool who thought he could find love from a mother who had abandoned him? Ethan's hand instinctively went to the small knife in his pocket. Just one cut, and Lucas would never be able to say another word. Lucas realized that, and he smiled. Do it. If you're really as strong as I taught you in this. Vivian immediately saw the change in her son's eyes. She stood up. Ethan, don't. Ethan looked down at the knife in his hand. His fingers clenched. Anger boiled in his veins. He deserved to die. He deserved to die. But then his eyes met Vivian's. There was no coldness, no distance. There was only fear, not for herself, but for him. Ethan realized one thing. If he killed Lucas, he would never be able to come back. He would become the monster Lucas had tried to create. Ethan slowly put the knife down on the table. Lucas looked at him, his lips curling in disappointment. You don't dare. That's why you always lose, Ethan. Ethan stood up, looking him straight in the eye. No, that's why I'm not like you. Lucas opened his mouth to say something, but Ethan had already turned and walked away. Vivian stood up too, looking at Lucas one last time. He's not your son. Her voice was low but firm. And I won't let him become you. Lucas looked after them, for the first time without anything to say. For the first time, he was truly defeated. The emotional open end. The news of Lucas Grant's arrest was all over the newspapers the next morning. Mob boss Lucas Grant arrested. Criminal empire collapses. Teen Ethan Walker acquitted after truth revealed. Judge Vivian Carter wins case. But can he reconcile with his son? Justice had been served. The perpetrators had been punished. But for Ethan, this was not a victory. He was free, but freedom did not mean everything was okay. The final verdict. Vivian stood in the courtroom, watching her son from a distance. Ethan had just walked out of the courtroom, where the judge had officially acquitted him. No one applauded. No joy eruptive. There was only silence. Vivian stepped closer, but Ethan stopped just a few feet away. He looked at her, his eyes no longer filled with hatred, but also no forgiveness. They were silent for several long seconds. Finally, Vivian spoke first. I know you can't forgive me right away, and I don't expect you to. Ethan said nothing, just bowed his head. She continued, her voice softer but sincere. I can't change the past, but I want the chance to fix the future. When you're ready, I'll be there. Ethan still didn't look at her, but his hand clenched slightly. Vivian took a deep breath, then slowly turned and walked away. He didn't call out to her. He didn't run after her. But as soon as she was almost out of sight in the crowd, he whispered, so softly that only he could hear, Mom. His footsteps faltered for a second, but then he lifted his head, shoved his hands in his pockets, and kept walking. Open ending. No tir felfax. No dramatique paligis. Just a glimmer of hope, but sometimes that's enough. Seconde chance. Life doesn't change overnight. There's no magic that can erase the past. But sometimes, all it takes is a chance to start over. Vivian Carter is no longer a judge. After the scandal, she resigned before she could be forced out. But she has no regrets. A year ago, if someone had told her she would give up her illustrious career to protect a child she once abandoned, she would have laughed it off as nonsense. But now, she stands in a youth support center, a place for lost children, children like Ethan. No one here calls her Judge Carter. They call her Miss Vivian. She teaches them about the law, about protecting themselves. She helps them find jobs, find paths other than crime. And most importantly, she doesn't abandon them. The children here are not hers. But every time she helped a child, she saw Ethan in them. And that kept her from stopping. Ethan was changing, too. He didn't go back to his old ways. Not because he believed in a brighter future, but because he didn't want to be like Lucas. He'd spent too many years bouncing from orphanage to orphanage, abused by gangs, abandoned by society. He knew that feeling. So when someone in the support program asked him if he wanted to help other kids, he hesitated. But then he thought of Vivian, who was still trying, even though she didn't have to. Maybe if she could try, so could he. He started working at the support center just a few nights a week. At first, he just watched silently. But gradually, he began to talk to other kids who looked up to him as a legend for surviving the harsh world. He told them that there was no easy way, but he also told them that they could choose a different path. And then he realized he was choosing a different path for himself, too. The relationship between mother and son. Ethan didn't call Vivian Mom right away. He kept his distance. There were still days when he didn't want to see her. There were still moments of anger over the past. But there were also days when he wondered, if he could change, why couldn't she? One day, he went to the support center during lunch. He saw Vivian sitting in an old chair, holding a cold cup of coffee, watching the kids concentrate on their law class. He walked over and slowly sat down next to her. Vivian looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. They just sat there in silence, but not as distant as before. Then, Ethan said softly, not looking at her, "You did well." Vivian didn't answer right away. She just smiled softly, tightening her grip on the coffee cup in her hand. Thank you. They still had a long way to go, but at least they had begun to walk it together. A new path. A year wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was enough to build something new. Vivian Carter was no longer a judge. She was no longer in the headlines or mentioned with a powerful title, but she had found something more important than fame. She found the opportunity to be a mother again. Ethan's basketball game. Today, she went to a small basketball court in downtown Los Angeles. The screech of shoes on the hardwood, the bouncing of balls, the cheers that echoed through the stands. It wasn't a big game, just a minor league game for teenagers. But for Vivian, this was one of the most important moments of her life. She had come to watch Ethan. She sat in the back row, unobtrusive, quietly observing. On the court, Ethan moved quickly, his eyes focused. He wasn't the best, but there was one thing that stood out to her. He didn't give up. Vivian had heard about Ethan's transformation from people at the support center. He wasn't fully integrated into society. He still had his down days, but he was trying. And to her, that was what mattered most. A mother-son moment. During the game, Ethan didn't look up at the stands, but she knew he saw her. Because as soon as the third quarter started, Ethan sped up, passed his opponent, jumped, and made a perfect shot. The ball arced through the air, then went straight into the basket. The crowd erupted, and for a fleeting moment, Vivian realized Ethan had deliberately scored right in front of her. She couldn't help but smile. No matter how he pretended, he wanted her to see him. When the game ended, Ethan walked off the court, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He saw her. They looked at each other for a few seconds. And then, in a low but firm voice, Ethan said softly, "You can come see me again if you want." There was no apology. No warli emotional moment. But for Vivian, that was enough. She smiled, her heart breaking silently. "I'll be there." And for the first time in so many years, she actually had the chance to be a mother again.